I'm Gary Nickerson,
And I'm Quinn Taggart.
and this is Outside My Window. For decades, the Founders Cemetery, the Free Will Baptist Cemetery, and the Calvinist Baptist Cemetery in Beaver River and Port Maitland were objects of neglect. Most people driving by didn't even know that these cemeteries, overgrown with alders and brush, were even their founders. In 1999, the Old Beaver River and Port Maitland Cemeteries Preservation Society, under the leadership of the Reverend Ulrich Dawson, was formed with a commitment to the restoration and maintenance of the three cemeteries. The Society's website documents the efforts to restore and maintain the cemeteries and also serves as a way people may access information about the residents in those three cemeteries. The cemeteries are registered heritage properties in Nova Scotia, and many of the residents have very interesting stories to tell, and the information on the site can provide much genealogical detail. There's a lot more to this story than just this short introduction, so to fill us in, we welcome our guest today, Bill Curry. Hi, Bill.
Hi there.
Thanks so much for coming on the program. So, Bill, I want to ask you, first of all, how did you become involved in this project?
Oh, well, great. Well, thanks for having me so much. I guess I got involved in two ways. The society started in 1999, and Norma and I, my wife and I, moved to the Yarmouth area in 2001. And we bought property in 2003 that was immediately next door to one of the three cemeteries. And so that's how I kind of got involved, because I sort of went over to see what was going on.
Quiet neighbors.
Exactly, yeah, except they weren't so quiet because they were over there with chainsaws and whatnot. It turned out that the cemetery that was right next to us, the Calvinist cemetery, was the last of the three to be cleared, and that's what they were doing when we came over and bought our land. They were clearing the land next to us.
Bill, what kind of shape were the headstones in? I mean, how much information were you able to glean from those?
Well, that's an interesting question. The cemeteries, when it was first started in 1999, they had been used, first of all, I guess, during the 1800s. So the earliest burial is in the very early 1800s, 1806, I think. Is our earliest one, and then the last one was right around 1890, and that's when actually the so-called new cemetery, or the one that most people here would know, the Port Maitland Beaver River Cemetery, was established. And so when the folks started working on them it was 1999. So the cemeteries had basically laid, we'll say, unused. There hadn't been a burial for 100 years. And the two churches that were associated, that we know were associated with those cemeteries, had disappeared in the late 1800s as well, so or early 1900s. And so basically they were three just sort of lots, and they were completely overgrown. The one next door to us, when we bought the property here, was just a tall patch of alders and a bunch of spruce trees and that kind of thing. And so when they went to work clearing it, because people knew that there were that it was a burial site, or that all three were burial sites, they really had a lot of work to do. So we found stones that were half buried. Some were completely buried. There's an interesting story of the newest one we found was just because I found a record of a gentleman that we knew was buried there, and then we found his wife and child by doing a little probing, sticking basically an 8-inch nail into the ground all around it to see if we could hit something. So I mean, it really depends on on the grave as to what we could get out of it or whatever. And there are ones that we know should be there that are missing. So we've got pieces of some grave markers, and we have footstones that should go with headstones, but we haven't found the headstone.
So at the point that the churches, I guess, went out of business, if I could use that phraseology, where would the responsibility have laid for the cemeteries? Would it revert to the municipality, the province? How did that all go?
Once the churches went down, then really that was the problem, is that there was nobody to look after them. So like I say, for about 100 years, they just sort of laid unused. And like a lot of cemeteries, and there are an awful lot of these types of cemeteries, small cemeteries that were near churches or near old homesteads that just become completely overgrown and in a lot of cases completely forgotten about.
So, what are you using for records? Would the records have been left behind?
So what we did was that's sort of my job. We have a large committee. We have 10 people on our board of directors, and each of the directors has a specific task. Alex Bloy, for instance, is our head maintenance guy. He's the one that looks after most of the mowing and causes it to be done, and then he he gets volunteers or sometimes hires a person or two to help him out. My job, I don't do much mowing because I've got my own lawn. But what I do is I do the history part. So I've used an awful lot of records, census records. We've got genealogical records. We've gone into the Yarmouth County Museum, and then we've used other websites that are readily available. There's a beautiful historical genealogical website that the government runs, the government of Nova Scotia, and that has records on birth, marriages, and deaths for a lot of people. And since these folks that we're talking about are all in the 1800s, it can take quite a bit of digging to find out about them. But yeah, we use a lot of different sources. But that's the fun I have is going through and finding out the genealogical information.
Many people will remember the late George Snow. You and he worked on a kind of an offshoot project. Can you talk about that, Bill?
Yeah, so what we did was we started with just the genealogical information, and so actually Wilfred Allen, who lives in Annapolis Royal now, he was the chair when I first joined the society. And Wilfred and George and I sat down every Wednesday kind of thing and went through and found out whatever genealogical information we could. When Wilfred moved away to Annapolis Royal, George and I started working on a little side thing. We thought it'd be kind of cool if we could put on our website not only the genealogical information, but any personal information we could find about people. So we did things like we found out where people lived, and so we would go through the town and say, so-and-so, if we could find out was a farmer and his address was at what is now. So, for instance, my house here, 3455 Highway 1 in Port Maitland, that was a man by the name of Sinclair, and he's buried in our cemeteries there. And so we put the information on his page.
Now, what about community input and involvement? You mentioned, the volunteers that helped clear the land and all of that. But was your committee able to sit down, perhaps with some of the older residents at the time of Port Maitland and Beaver River, and sort of get some recollections and memories from them?
Yes, and that's where George is invaluable because he knew pretty well everybody. And so what would happen would be George would go through and come up with the details. We used to have, pre-COVID, we had an event, I guess you'd call it, every summer where we'd have Port Maitland Heritage Days. We used it as a fundraiser for Old Stones so that we could pay for the mowing and that kind of stuff. But we'd also always put on a program, and so we would have George and some other folks. Sometimes we did sea tales, for instance, so George would talk about his life as a fisherman, and we brought in other people who were sometimes more senior residents who had been fishermen or in some cases still were, that kind of thing. Or another year we talked about carpenters, and so who had been a carpenter in the area and that kind of thing. So, yeah, we've had a lot of community input. It's a community effort. The QR codes that we'll talk about in a bit, they were actually placed by a class of grade 4 students at Port Maitland Elementary School, so we even got the schools involved.
When you think back, anybody that wanted to research the genealogy of their own family and whatever might be just sort of romping around cemeteries and the like. Do you still get a lot of in-person visits, if I can call it that?
Yeah, so we put a book, a guest book, I guess you'd call it, for folks to sign when they came into the cemetery, and we encourage them to ask questions and that kind of thing. We also on our website have a form where people can send us an email and ask about their ancestors, that kind of thing. And as a result of that, yes, we get a lot of people. We do put on, again, pre-COVID, we put on sessions where I lead little tours, and so people take people through the various of the three cemeteries. The last one we did was in Calvinist Cemetery, and then we went over to the new cemetery because some people were removed. So they were originally buried in one of our three historic cemeteries and then may have been moved to the new cemetery in the early 1900s. And so we've done tours where we've taken people through the cemetery so that they can see and understand what was going on.
So, jumping ahead, I guess, to the 21st century, you've got Ancestry.com and a whole bunch of other databases that are available online. So with that in mind, give us some background of how your website content and so on came about, and then maybe roll into how the QR code thing kind of came about, because that's really cool.
Yeah. So you're right. There are a lot of websites out there. Ancestry is one. Find a Grave is another one. The only thing you have to realize about those is that they're sites that people put stuff up on as volunteers, and that's great. It allows people to put up a lot of information, but you always have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, I guess I'd call it. And so we always were looking for the primary documentation. So what we did, which we thought was kind of neat, was we came up with a list of our residents, the people that had been buried there, and then we put in as much genealogical information as we could find. And we tried to use actual birth certificates, marriage certificates, or death information that we could find. That led us then to come up with the idea, and when we did this just within the last 8 or 10 years, of putting QR codes on the markers. And what that allowed us to do was to put a QR code in front of each gravestone so that somebody with a cell phone or a tablet can go and wave their tablet over the QR code and bring up all that information that we have. So they're not just looking at the whatever information's on the stone. They can find the whole family history there.
Is that unique? Because the first time that I remember chatting with Alex about this a couple of years back, it seemed to me like that was such an excellent idea and a very unique use of the technology. So is it something that's unique, or is it something that you've borrowed from somewhere else?
The way we did it, I think, is pretty unique. It is in use in some cemeteries. So, for instance, if you go to some big historic cemetery, national cemeteries, like in the U.S., if you go to the Arlington National Cemetery, they'll have QR codes on some folks' graves, normally somebody of note, a famous general or that kind of thing. But what we did was we made a QR code for every single person. So we have a QR code for every resident in our cemeteries. And what that does that's I think quite a bit unique is that means, of course, that we have a page for every single person. So we've had other cemeteries say, oh, we should put a QR code on our cemetery. And I ask them, well, what would it link to? And they say, well, to our cemetery page. But but we go way beyond that. We made a page for each person. And I think that's really kind of unique. We do get a lot of people who are interested in, shall I say, more formal genealogy using our site as well, in a rather unique thing that could take me quite a while to explain, but I'll make it short. Yarmouth has a huge number of people who are Mayflower descendants. So they descended from the folks in 1620 who came to Plymouth, Mass. on the Mayflower. And it's a fluke of history or whatever that most of the founding families in Yarmouth in 1761 were Mayflower descendant families. Since the folks in our cemetery are the kids and grandkids of those founding people, we have about 65 or so % of the people in our cemeteries who could be Mayflower descendants. So we get an awful lot of people coming up here from Massachusetts who are trying to prove their Mayflower ancestry. And if they can link to one of our residents, they've got a really good shot because we've done a lot of work for them.
Wow, that's really interesting. So let's take a side tangent, I guess. How would they have gotten from Plymouth, Mass to here? Did they like miss their connection or something?
No, it's really interesting. So if you go to the early history of both Yarmouth and Barrington, they were both founded in the same week in 1761. And what it was in Yarmouth's case, it was 5 families from Sandwich, Massachusetts. And in Barrington's case, it was about 10 families from Cape Cod. And of course, Sandwich, Massachusetts, if you know any Massachusetts geography, is immediately across what's now the Cape Cod Canal, what then was a little creek from Plymouth, Mass. And so all 5 of the founding families of Yarmouth, who came in June of 1761, were Mayflower descendants. And it was very similar in Barrington. A lot of the people that went to Barrington from Cape Cod were relatives of Mayflowers. And because you're talking 100 years later, like 1761, where the Mayflower came in 1620, there had been a lot of marriages that had sort of fluxed back and forth. I don't want to say intermarriages, but but there were a lot of people in a small area. For instance, one Mayflower passenger, one pair, John Howland and his wife Elizabeth Tilley, by the time they died in their 80s, they had 88 grandchildren. And living in a small town like Plymouth, there were bound to be intermarriages, you know, when you get 2 or 3 generations down the line.
So let's go back a second to when you were chatting about, finding the headstones after you kind of cleared the land a bit and so on. I would imagine that there would be a few that would have been made, say, out of wood or whatever, that would have degraded over the years. So what percentage out of the lot is unaccounted for?
Well, that's a really interesting question. We have a document, I guess I'll call it, from the 1890s when a gentleman from New England came through the area, and he did something that was really quite amazing because this is, of course, way before computers. He wrote down by hand a list of every person in a bunch of cemeteries that he could find. And fortunately for us, all 3 of our cemeteries were 3 that he visited. So we have a list of everybody who he saw stones for in 1890. So it varies by cemetery, I guess, is the answer to your question. So in the Calvinist cemetery, I said we've found about 30 people. There should be about 50. So we're missing about 20. In Founders, we've got, I think it's around 50 or 60 people, and there should be somewhere around 70 or 80. So we've got most people in that cemetery. And then the big one is the Baptist cemetery, the Free Will Baptist Cemetery. There are about 120 or so people in there, and we know there's probably about 50 more. But the problem is that a lot of people were removed from the 3 cemeteries, and some they took their stones and some they didn't when they moved them. And then there are other things that we sort of lose track on, where in one case in Founders Cemetery, somebody in the 50s walked into the overgrown area and walked out with a gravestone. And we were just lucky to find out about it, that when somebody in the family found out that they had a stone that was one of ours, they, I don't know, guilty conscience or whatever, but they they said, we've got a stone of yours, and they returned it to us. And actually, it's a beautiful stone because it was stored inside for 50 years.
Oh my Lord, why would somebody do that? It just boggles your mind, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it was a thing back in the 50s and 60s. People, they would take the stones and people use them as, outdoor picnic tables or, pavers for driveways or whatever. I don't know. It's kind of weird, but there you are.
I'm just shaking my head, Gary, so looking at me the same way. So in that same vein, if people were moved, was that documented, or are you just kind of guessing as things went by?
No. So they were moved, and it's well documented. What happened was the new cemetery, the current Beaver River Port Maitland Cemetery, was established in 1890. And, of course, by that time, two of the three cemeteries, Founders and Calvinist, the churches were no longer standing, and so they had been out of use for at least 25 years. What we think happened is one of the first people who was buried over in the current Port Maitland Cemetery, his niece had been buried across the street here in the Calvinist Cemetery, and somebody in the family must have said, "Gee, we're burying Uncle Lemuel. I wonder where his niece is." And somebody must have said, "Well, she's across the road." "Well, that's not right. We'll bring her over here." And so there you go. And it started I don't know if you call it a fad. It's kind of coolish if that's what you call it. But it started a thing. And over the next 30 or 40 years, about 100 people were removed from the three cemeteries and moved into the current cemetery.
What about environmental factors? Because I mean, we're all talking about global warming and a lot more rain or a lot less rain depending on where you're standing. So how do environmental factors affect a cemetery overall? Is that a major thing?
It is if you don't look after them. So the problem is that when they were overgrown, the stones, of course, some of them were lying down, face down, and some of them face up. Some of them were partially buried, that kind of thing. And some of them had fallen over and broken, like smashed into pieces. So that's really the issue you have. We do have some stones that we have to cover. So we've got about 4 what we call old New England slate stones. And slate, if you're familiar with it, is sort of a layered stone. So the face of the stone is carved into, but the whole thing, it's like a layer of chalkboards. And so the face of it could fall off. And that would occur, for instance, if the rain got in there and then it froze in the wintertime. So we built what we call dog houses. We built these wooden covers to go over the slate stones. And we've done that to about 4 of our stones that are in the worst shape. But that is, definitely an issue. Acid rain from back in the 60s and 70s wears, particularly on marble stones. Those would be the white stones that you see. The etching gets sort of worn away over time. So it's one of these things where it's really good to preserve it. And that's the other thing we did on the website. We took images. I'm a photographer, as some of your listeners will know. I went around and took images of every single stone from a bunch of different angles. So we tried to record each stone as best we could so that people could see what was going on. And I did that about 20 years ago. So some of those stones have degraded just in the 20 years.
So have any of the other cemeteries in the area taken some cues from what you guys are doing and upped their game to match?
Well,
I'll put the challenge out there, I guess, if the
I don't think anybody's done the website thing and gone with the page by page, resident by resident. But I know some of the cemeteries, we've been in contact, or many cemeteries have contacted us and asked us what we did and had us explain how we did it. I've given in-services to a bunch of cemeteries. But there are some interesting things where the Town Point Cemetery in Chebogue, or Chebogue Cemetery on Town Point, I should say, it has a couple thousand people in it. So, I think it'd be out of reach to put a page up for every person. But on the other hand, they've got a beautiful map. We've got maps in each of our cemeteries so that people can find the folks, that kind of thing. So, those are the kind of things that we love seeing people do. The old Hebron Cemetery, Riverside, that's sort of behind the Masonic Hall. That one, I've got a record of every person that's buried in there, but I haven't had the time to put together a website for it, and I don't know if I ever will. But if somebody wants the information, I'll share it with them.
Very nice. Bill, I want to ask you about the stones and markers at these 3 cemeteries. Were they hewn and carved locally?
Some of them were, yes, and some of them weren't. What happens is in the 1800s, there were people that went around from community to community. And so if somebody had died, they would be sort of commissioned, I guess you'd call it. There is a company. There was a company in St. John, New Brunswick, that made quite a few of them. What's interesting is on a lot of these stones, the initials of the carver are on the back. Most of them below grade, so below soil level. But it is kind of interesting. So we do know in some cases who the carvers were, and the answer to your question is yes, both. So some were local, some were fancier and came from away, and some are very highly detailed pieces that would have taken a real craftsperson to create.
You mentioned the grade 4 students, Bill, at Port Maitland Elementary were involved in the.
QR codes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You saw my blank look when
Yeah.
the QR code on these stones, and I want to ask you, Bill, why is it important that young people and communities get involved in projects like that? Why is it important to preserve and maintain these old cemeteries?
Yeah. Well, that's really the heart of the whole program. So let me back up to that grade 4 experience. So I'll give you two little instances, and it'll show you the importance, I think. As a teacher, a former teacher, I think you can know that this is where my heart is with all this. It teaches the kids living history, so it's history that they can actually associate with. So the day we were setting the QR codes, we gave each kid a brick with a QR code, and we said, go find the individual, and we did a little mapping exercise where they had to go and look on the map and then go run over to their individual. And then one of our volunteers came over and helped the kids put the bricks in place. Two little girls ran over, and they were in front of our what we call our Ernie monument. And Ernie was, I believe it's Els was the last name, was a person who had died, and it's a cute little gravestone. It's small. It's only about 1.5 feet high, and it has a little lamb on top. Now, what people who are aware of cemeteries will know is that most of the time when there's a little lamb on top of a grave, it's because it was a child. So these two young girls, I remember, ran over, and they had Ernie's grave marker on their list. They ran over, and they went there, and they were all smiles and giggles and all that stuff. And then they read the information on the stone, and the look on their faces when they realized that, oh, this was a 3-year-old that we were looking at. Well, then it was, well, what happened to him? How did that happen? Who's he? And so you can imagine the kind of conversations that our volunteers had with those two young girls. And then the other one was a very similar thing. One of the boys, just one of these fluky things, he on his list, he saw this gentleman's name, and I'm sorry, I can't remember, but the story's on our website if you want to go through it. And he ran over and found the guy, and then he read the information because the QR code, we had cell phones out there. He read it, and it turned out it was his great-great-grandfather. And, I mean, that's one of those, cue the Twilight Zone music, but he's finding out his direct family history.
So you couldn't do this, obviously, without volunteers. So if somebody's interested in helping out, how best for them to get a hold of you guys?
It would be wonderful. They can go on our website, or they can email me directly if they like. I don't know if you want me to give my email address.
I mean, it's up to you. Go ahead.
Sure. So it's Bill, just BILL, and then Bill Curry, BILLCURRY.ca. And if you just email me and tell me you're interested, that'd be great. We're always looking for volunteers or for people to be on our board. Our big thing is the fundraising, which we just had a couple of weeks ago, or August, I guess it was. We had our big annual fundraiser this year. And we're always looking for people to help out. So, and you're absolutely right. People talk to me or they talk to Alex, but it's way more than the two of us. There are a very large number of hardworking people behind the scenes.
No, absolutely, and I'm sure that with COVID, it's put a little bit of a damper on a lot of your activities.
Yeah, our fundraising this year, we did a yard sale and we held it outside. so that we didn't have to go in the fire hall, which would have meant social distancing and all that stuff. So we did it outside. We wore masks. We had a great big yard sale, and we did a little barbecue and that kind of thing. And the community, as always, was extremely generous, and we did well enough that we covered our expenses for this year. So that was great.
Just quickly, Bill, is the website still called the Old Beaver River and Port Maitland Cemeteries Preservation Society?
No, it is
That's
not.
a mouthful.
So
good.
we took a look at that back in about 2009 or 2010, and that was interesting name and very descriptive, but way too long. So how you find us is you go to www.oldstones.ca, and Old Stones is all one word, so OLDSTONES.
Well, that's a lot easier to remember.
We all thank you for shortening that up.
Well, the first thing was when I first got on the board, I was doing some treasury work, and I said, "There's no way I'm signing that on checks."
Bill, we can't thank you enough. It's been fascinating, and we appreciate it so much, and we hope that people will reach out to your organization and society and, glean some more information from that, whether they're local folks in the Beaver River, Port Maitland area, or perhaps other parts of the province. Thanks again, Bill.
Well, thanks so much for having us, and thanks for your interest.
I'm Gary Nickerson.
And I'm Quinn Taggart.
And this has been Outside My Window.